They said it was illness. They said it was fragility. They said there was nothing that could be done. But no one explained why a girl who couldn't walk moved her toes at the exact moment the truth began to surface. No one explained why she only fell asleep after drinking juice. Nor why a poor boy, ignored by everyone, was the only one who saw what was really happening. This is not a story about an obvious villain. It's about blind trust. About convenient silence. About the danger of believing too much in those who appear to care. Because sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from outside the house. It comes from the one who holds the key. And the most disturbing part isn't the plan itself. It's how long it almost worked. If that boy had arrived 5 minutes later, this story might not be told today. Stay until the end, because what begins as a child's accusation ends up revealing something far greater than a family betrayal. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard so they don't repeat themselves, subscribe to the channel now to follow more content like this. In the wide garden of the mansion, where silence usually felt comfortable, something broke irreversibly. The hurried sound of small footsteps cut through the air before anyone even realized where the tension was coming from. Noah came running out from between the ornamental trees, his breathing uneven and his clothes stained with dirt, as if he had crossed through fear itself to get there. The afternoon sun beat down hard on his sweaty face, but nothing seemed heavier than what he carried in his chest. His eyes searched for someone specific, ignoring everyone else around him. He didn't come to ask for help. He came to expose something no one was ready to hear. Felipe stood beside Laura's wheelchair, in one of those moments when the exhaustion was not physical, but accumulated over months of uncertainty. He adjusted the blanket over his daughter's legs with automatic care, while Lucia remained just behind, hands firm on the handles, posture impeccable. It was a scene rehearsed by routine. Everything seemed under control. Until Noah's voice exploded in the middle of the garden, too loud for a child, too steady for a delusion. She puts things in Laura's food. The words didn't ask permission. They fell like a heavy object in the center of the space, impossible to ignore. For a second no one reacted. Not Felipe. Not Lucia. Not Laura. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if the garden itself were trying to understand what it had just heard. Noah stood a few feet away from them, hands trembling, eyes wide, waiting for something he himself couldn't define. Maybe a denial. Maybe a scream. Maybe someone would say he was wrong. But the silence was even more frightening. Too long to be comfortable. Too long to be innocent. Lucia was the first to move, even if discreetly. A small adjustment of her chin, a slight narrowing of her eyes, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. Laura remained motionless, staring at her own lap, as if that sentence had not been directed at her. Felipe, in turn, took a few seconds longer to react, as if he were trying to decide whether he had heard correctly. Noah took a step forward, pushed by the absence of a response. He didn't look like a boy making a random accusation. He looked like someone who had rehearsed that sentence dozens of times before finally saying it. The wind passed through the tall leaves, spreading a soft sound that contrasted with the growing tension. Noah swallowed hard and repeated it, with less force but more urgency, like someone afraid of losing courage. She puts it in the juice. Always. The word always hung in the air, too heavy for a child to carry alone. Felipe felt something different that time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disbelief. It was a cold jolt of attention. Something inside him woke up, still confused but too alert to ignore. Lucia took a deep breath, like someone preparing to correct a confused child. Her lips curved into something that tried to look like understanding, but there was too much tension in her shoulders. She opened her mouth, ready to take control of the situation, but didn't speak immediately. Perhaps because she realized that all eyes, even the most distant ones, were now fixed on that scene. Noah didn't look away from her. He didn't blink. It was a silent confrontation that no one had announced, but that was already underway. Laura moved her hands slightly over her lap, a small, almost involuntary gesture. Her eyes stayed lowered, but her body seemed too rigid for someone who was simply tired. Felipe noticed it without knowing why. Something about that posture didn't match the medical explanations he had been hearing for months. Noah's sentence echoed in his mind, repeated, rearranged, searching for meaning. She puts things in the food. Things. Not medicine. Not vitamins. Things. The choice of the word bothered him more than the content. The boy was breathing fast as if he feared being interrupted at any moment. His fingers clenched into dirty fists and he took another step forward. "I saw it," he added, almost in a whisper, as if that were the most dangerous part of the story. No one had asked for proof. No one had asked for details. but Noah felt he needed to go further before they dismissed him. The garden, once a place of calm, now seemed too small to contain what was about to come out. Felipe finally lifted his eyes, first to Noah, then slowly to Lucia. He said nothing. He asked no questions yet. But something in his gaze had shifted. The tired father gave way to someone who was beginning to connect invisible dots. Lucia noticed. Laura did too. And Noah, seeing that look, understood that he could no longer turn back. What he had started there was not just an accusation. It was the beginning of something no one in that garden would be able to control from that moment on. In the air lingered the uncomfortable feeling that that simple sentence hid much more than it seemed. Something that couldn't be explained by childish imagination alone. Something that, if true, would change everything. And before any adult could regain control of the situation, a silent question began to grow inside Felipe. A question he still didn't have the courage to ask out loud, but that already demanded answers. Felipe remained silent for a few seconds longer than usual, long enough for everyone to notice that something had changed inside him. It wasn't a sudden gesture, nor an exaggerated reaction. It was the look. The same look that months earlier closed multimillion-dollar deals and identified invisible risks in complex reports now drifted away from the scene as a father and began to analyze it as someone trained to distrust. His shoulders squared, his breathing became more controlled, and the fatigue that usually weighed on his face gave way to a cold attentiveness. He was no longer just listening. He was evaluating. He turned his eyes to Noah first, noticing details that would have gone unnoticed before. The way the boy held his gaze. The slight tremor in his hands. The irregular breathing that didn't match a simple attempt to get attention. Felipe knew human behavior well. He knew when someone was making up a story and when someone was struggling to tell a truth far too heavy for their age. And Noah didn't look like someone improvising. He looked like someone carrying a burden too big for a small body. Without saying a word, Felipe leaned slightly toward the boy, reducing the distance between them. There was no threat in his posture, only focus. He didn't interrupt him, didn't correct him, didn't ask him to calm down. He simply observed. That active silence was something Lucia knew well. It was the same silence that preceded important decisions, strategic cuts, definitive changes. She noticed it before anyone else. And it unsettled her. Felipe then slowly shifted his gaze to Lucia. It wasn't a quick or accusatory movement. It was calculated. He looked at her as if revisiting something familiar from a new perspective. Her restrained smile suddenly seemed out of place. Small details began to bother him. The overly firm posture. The exaggerated control of the environment. The way she always positioned herself between him and Laura. Things that once seemed like care were now beginning to take on another shape. Laura felt the change before she even understood the reason. The atmosphere around her father was different. Heavier. More alert. She lifted her eyes for a brief instant and met his gaze for just a second. It was enough for Felipe to notice something he had been ignoring for far too long. There wasn't only fragility there. There was expectation. As if she were waiting for a specific reaction. As if she knew that moment was decisive. Felipe took a deep breath, organizing thoughts that were beginning to align in an uncomfortable way. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He never had. But he also couldn't ignore patterns. Noah's words echoed in his mind, now connected to scattered memories he had treated as coincidences until then. The sudden fainting. The vague explanations. The appointments always mediated. None of it seemed so neutral anymore. He ran his tongue over his lips, an almost imperceptible gesture, typical of when he was about to ask difficult questions. He didn't ask yet. He chose to observe more. To let others speak first. In his experience, people made mistakes when they believed they were in control of the narrative. Lucia seemed too confident. Noah seemed too tense. Laura seemed too trapped. That imbalance caught his attention like a silent warning. Felipe took a step back, creating a strategic distance that allowed him to see everyone at once. The wheelchair, Lucia behind it, Noah in front, Laura at the center. The arrangement of that scene felt too symbolic to ignore. He felt something cold run down his spine, not fear but clarity. Something there wasn't right. And he had ignored it for far too long. Without raising his voice, Felipe finally spoke, but he made no accusation. He simply said Noah's name in a calm, firm, inviting tone. It was a simple call but loaded with intention. Lucia realized that this was no ordinary conversation. It was the beginning of a silent interrogation. And Laura, upon hearing her father's voice in that specific tone, felt her heart race as if she knew there was no turning back. The garden remained the same. The trees, the sun, the apparent silence. But inside, the dynamics had changed completely. Felipe was no longer just a father trying to protect his daughter. He was beginning to assemble a dangerous puzzle. And Noah, realizing that he was finally being taken seriously, understood that he needed to tell everything before someone stopped him. And that was exactly what Lucia would try to do next. Lucia was quick to realize she was losing control of the narrative. Felipe's attentive silence did not work in her favor, and Noah's firm presence in front of them made everything even more unstable. So she did what had always worked. She adjusted her posture, softened her expression, and adopted that sweet tone that seemed tailor-made for delicate situations. A tone that didn't attack directly but diminished. She leaned slightly forward as if speaking patiently, and offered a small, understanding smile, carefully calculated to look like concern. She began by saying that children get confused, that they mix dreams with reality, that they exaggerate when they are nervous. She didn't accuse Noah of lying. That would have been too aggressive. She chose something more subtle. She said he must be frightened, perhaps overwhelmed by Laura's condition. That all of this was the product of a fertile imagination. As she spoke, she lightly touched Felipe's arm, a gesture that once conveyed partnership, but now seemed like an attempt to anchor him emotionally. Noah felt the blow. Not because he believed her but because he already knew that speech. He had heard similar words before in other situations, whenever he tried to warn someone about something wrong. His body stiffened, and he looked away for a moment, as if he had to find strength somewhere invisible. He didn't expect to be embraced. But he also didn't expect to be diminished like that in front of everyone. Lucia continued, each sentence carefully constructed to sound rational. She talked about stress, about how Laura's illness affected everyone around her. She said Noah spent too much time alone, creating stories. That maybe he had seen something he didn't understand. The tone was calm, almost maternal. But there was something hard behind the words. Something that tried to end the matter without truly facing it. Felipe didn't react immediately. He simply observed. The speech was too familiar. He himself had used similar strategies in difficult negotiations, when he needed to discredit a source without appearing unfair. And that was exactly what bothered him. Lucia didn't seem surprised. She seemed prepared. As if she had already rehearsed that response. As if that accusation was not, to her, something unthinkable but merely inconvenient. Laura remained silent, hands clenched together. The sound of Lucia's voice seemed to pass through her in a strange way. It wasn't comfort. It was pressure. She felt her father's fiancée's gaze on her, even without being looked at directly. And that made her slightly hunch her shoulders, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one full of meaning. Felipe noticed. And it added to the growing list of signs he was beginning to register mentally. Lucia then took a step forward, placing herself partially between Felipe and Noah, as if she were protecting both of them from unnecessary confusion. She said that this was neither the time nor the place for that kind of conversation. That everyone was tired. That the boy should go rest. The attempt to end the matter came wrapped in care, but carried far too much urgency. The urgency of someone who needed everything to end right there. Noah felt his heart race. He realized that if he backed down at that moment he might never have another chance. The way Lucia spoke made it seem as though he was the problem. That the truth was inconvenient. He clenched his fists tighter, took a deep breath, and lifted his eyes again, now directly toward Felipe. Not Lucia. He needed at least one person to believe him. Felipe held the boy's gaze for several long seconds. Long enough for Lucia to feel the discomfort grow. The game of discrediting was not working as before. Something was slipping out of control. Felipe still said nothing, but his expression did not reflect doubt. It reflected calculation. He was weighing versions. Comparing behaviors. And Lucia was beginning to realize that, for the first time, her emotional authority was being questioned. The wind blew again through the trees, and the garden seemed even more silent. Lucia's attempt to end everything right there had failed. Noah was still there. Felipe was still attentive. And Laura, trapped between the two, felt that something about to be revealed could change her life irreversibly. Childish imagination was no longer such a comfortable explanation. And Noah knew that if he wanted to be taken seriously, he needed to go beyond words. He needed to show how it happened. Noah took a deep breath before speaking again, as if organizing each word to avoid being interrupted. He knew that accusing was not enough. He needed to explain. He needed to show that it was neither imagination nor childish confusion. His eyes quickly scanned the garden, making sure no one else was approaching, and then fixed on Felipe. Not Lucia. It was to him that Noah would speak now. It was on him that he placed all his chances. With his hands still trembling, Noah described the vial. Small. Transparent. No label. He said it was kept out of curious eyes, but he had seen it more than once. The liquid inside was too clear to draw attention, almost like water. And that was exactly why no one suspected anything. Noah said Lucia always handled it carefully as if it were something precious. She never poured it directly. She always dripped it. A little. Calculated. He explained that the ritual repeated itself almost every day. Fresh orange juice always served in the same glass. A seemingly caring gesture, almost symbolic. Before bringing the glass to Laura, Lucia would step aside slightly, just enough not to be seen. That was the moment when the vial appeared. 2 or 3 drops. Sometimes more. Never less. Then the vial disappeared again as if it had never existed. Felipe felt his stomach tighten. The description was far too detailed to be the product of invention. Noah did not speak like someone imagining things. He spoke like someone observing. Like someone memorizing. Small gestures. Sequence. Timing. He even described the way Lucia stirred the glass afterward, slowly rotating it so the liquid would mix without leaving traces. Excessive care for something supposedly harmless. Lucia tried to interrupt, letting out a short, nervous laugh, saying it was absurd. But Noah continued. He said it wasn't only in the juice. Sometimes it was mixed into other drinks. Always something clear. Always something easy to disguise. He spoke softly but firmly. Like someone who knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but could no longer stop. Laura felt a chill run through her body. That description awakened something strange inside her. Not a clear memory but a sensation. An old discomfort. The taste of the juice. The sudden fatigue. The drowsiness that came soon after. She swallowed hard, trying to follow every word Noah said, as if she were assembling a puzzle inside her own mind. Felipe kept his gaze fixed on the boy, but his mind was already several steps ahead. Timing. Frequency. Liquid substance. Mixed into drinks. He recognized that pattern. Not as a father but as someone who had investigated sophisticated frauds. That wasn't random. It was method. And method required intent. Noah finished by saying it always happened before the main meals. Before lunch. Before dinner. Never early in the morning. Never very late at night. As if whoever was doing it knew exactly when the effect needed to happen. He couldn't say the name of what it was. But he knew the effect. Laura became heavy. Slow. Confused. And then she slept. Lucia was now visibly tense. Her fingers pressed tightly together, and her smile had disappeared completely. She tried to shift the focus, saying the boy was mixing things up, that none of it made sense. But the confidence in her voice was no longer the same. Every detail Noah added seemed to strip away another layer of protection around her. The garden seemed to shrink with every sentence. Felipe felt he could no longer treat this as a distant hypothesis. Something very concrete was being described there. Something repeated. Plant. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that possibility settle in his chest. It wasn't just about a tampered drink. It was about control. About someone deciding when his daughter could or could not be conscious. And as silence spread among them once again, an inevitable question began to form in Felipe's mind. If this was true, where else could that vial be hidden? The silence that settled after Noah's words was not empty. It was heavy. Laura felt that weight pressing against her chest as everyone waited for her reaction. Felipe slowly turned toward his daughter, expecting some confirmation or denial. One word would have been enough. A gesture. Anything. But Laura didn't speak right away. She remained still for a few seconds, long enough to feel unnatural. Before opening her mouth, Laura did something no one expected. Her eyes moved, first discreetly, then more clearly. She looked at Lucia. It wasn't an accusatory look. It was a searching look. As if she were looking for a ready-made answer. As if she were asking for permission to say something she didn't know if she was allowed to say. That single gesture was more disturbing than any sentence spoken so far. Felipe felt his heart race. That silent exchange said far more than words. He knew his daughter well. He knew her fears, her silences, her habits. And that look was not normal. It wasn't the look of someone who depended physically on another person. It was the look of someone conditioned, trained, used to weighing consequences before speaking. Lucia noticed the movement immediately. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, almost imperceptible, and she slightly tilted her head in a gesture that could be interpreted as encouragement or warning. The smile didn't return, but her presence became even more dominant. Laura felt it. Her body reacted before her mind could organize what to say. I don't know, Laura began, her voice weak. But she stopped, swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened on the blanket over her legs. She seemed stuck between what she felt and what she thought she should say. Felipe saw the inner struggle. That wasn't confusion. It was restraint. And that restraint had an address. Noah watched in silence, feeling a knot form in his throat. He knew that look. He had seen it before. Every time Lucia entered the kitchen. Every time Laura hesitated before drinking the juice. In that moment, he understood that Laura knew more than she was saying. Or at least felt more than she could explain. Felipe crouched down in front of his daughter, trying to be at eye level with her. He spoke calmly without pressure. He said she could speak. That no one would punish her for telling the truth. But Laura didn't respond immediately. Her eyes went back once again to Lucia. An automatic reflex. As if she were used to checking invisible limits. Lucia then tried to soften the scene, saying that Laura was confused, tired, emotionally fragile. But her words no longer had the same effect. Her daughter's gesture had spoken louder. Felipe felt a mix of anger and guilt spread through him. He hadn't noticed it before. He hadn't seen how much his daughter seemed to depend not only physically, but emotionally, on another person's permission. Laura finally murmured that sometimes she felt strange after drinking the juice. That her body felt heavy. That her head felt far away. But she stopped again. As if she had said more than she should. The fear was visible. Not fear of the truth but of the consequences of telling it completely. The garden was completely silent now. Even the birds seemed to have moved away. Felipe realized that that hesitation was the most serious sign so far. It wasn't just an external suspicion. It was learned behavior. Something someone had installed there little by little, day after day. And while Felipe tried to decide what the next step would be, a question began to hammer in his mind. If Laura needed to look at Lucia before speaking, what else was she being prevented from remembering? Laura took a deep breath, as if preparing to cross a dark place inside her own mind. Felipe's words still echoed, offering reassurance, but fear did not fade easily. When she finally spoke again, her voice came out low, hesitant, almost as if she were confessing something forbidden. She said there were things she simply could not remember. They weren't small details. They were entire chunks of time that seemed erased. She explained that after the fainting episode at the hospital, everything became confused. She remembered the bright light on the ceiling, the smell of cleaning products, the distant sound of footsteps. But from that point on her memories grew hazy. She knew people said she had gone to doctors, undergone tests, attended important appointments. But when she tried to recall them, nothing came. No rooms. No faces. No conversations. Just an uncomfortable emptiness. Felipe felt the air leave his lungs for a moment. He himself had accompanied much of that process, or at least he believed he had. He remembered Lucia bringing reports, commenting on medical guidance, explaining treatments. Everything seemed organized, planned. Now, hearing that his own daughter remembered none of it made that organization feel artificial. Like a set built for someone who had never truly been present. Laura continued, gaining courage as she spoke. She said that sometimes she woke up without knowing what day it was. That she asked questions and received answers that seemed to have already been given before. That she felt a kind of fog in her head, as if her thoughts slipped away before settling. She spoke carefully, looking at her father, but still felt Lucia's presence like a constant shadow. Noah followed every word, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Relief that Laura was finally saying something that confirmed his suspicions. Fear because it sounded far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just something put in the juice. It was something that interfered with memory, with consciousness. He clenched his fists again, remembering all the times Laura seemed too distant to respond. Felipe tried to organize the information like pieces of a puzzle. Fainting. Memory loss. Appointments that no one could really confirm. He knew medical protocols. He knew that patients usually remembered even vaguely repeated examinations. Complete erasure was not common. Something didn't fit. And the more he thought about it, the more the discomfort grew. Lucia interrupted, saying it was normal. That trauma caused lapses. That Laura was under intense stress. But for the first time her explanation sounded fragile. Felipe noticed she avoided details. She spoke in general terms. She didn't mention dates, names, procedures. Just justifications that were far too broad for something so specific. Laura then revealed something that made the atmosphere even heavier. She said she never remembered entering clinics after that day. Never remembered waiting in rooms. Never remembered talking to doctors. It was as if everything had happened outside of her. As if someone else had lived it for her and then told her afterward. The sensation frightened her, but she didn't know how to explain why. Felipe felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just negligence. It was control. Someone was deciding what Laura could remember, what she could forget. He realized that his daughter's illness might not be the main cause of everything. It might just be the perfect excuse. Silence spread again, heavier than before. Laura seemed exhausted from having said all of that. Lucia remained still, her face tense, avoiding looking directly at Felipe. Noah felt that each revelation made the danger more real. And while Felipe tried to remain calm on the outside, a new question formed in his mind. If Laura didn't remember the appointments, who exactly had gone in her place? Noah waited for Laura to finish speaking before addressing them again. He felt the weight of what was happening, but he knew this was the moment when he had to be precise. He couldn't be wrong. He couldn't exaggerate. He simply needed to say what he knew. And what he knew now fit disturbingly well with everything that was being revealed. He explained that his mother worked at the same hospital Lucia had mentioned. Every day. Without exception. She knew the schedules, the shifts, the routines. And precisely because of that, Noah was certain of one thing. After Laura's fainting episode, she had not gone back there. At least not in the way they claimed. He stated firmly that Laura and Lucia spent almost all their time at home. There were no frequent outings. No long trips. No in-person appointments. Felipe felt his stomach drop. That was more than a detail. It was a direct contradiction. If there were no hospital visits, where did the reports come from? Who issued them? He kept his face neutral, but inside he was already drawing invisible lines between facts that were beginning to form a troubling pattern. A pattern of staging. Noah said his mother talked about patients, corridors, doctors. She spoke about who came in and out. And she never mentioned Laura after that day. Never talked about her exams. Never commented on accompanying her to appointments. If something like that had happened, Noah would have heard about it. He was sure of it. That wasn't forgetfulness. It was real absence. Lucia tried to react, saying there were home visits, special care arrangements. But the justification sounded far too improvised. Felipe noticed. Noah noticed. Even Laura seemed taken aback by that explanation. Lucia's tone lost its flow. Her sentences began to stumble slightly, as if she were choosing words in real time. Felipe then asked a simple, almost casual question. He asked how many times Laura had gone to the hospital after the fainting episode. Lucia hesitated for a second. A small second, but a revealing one. She answered with something vague, without numbers, without dates. It was enough to trigger another warning. Noah added that on the days Lucia claimed to have taken Laura to appointments, they were at home. He remembered because he was the one playing in the yard, the one who saw the wheelchair pass through the hallway, the one who heard the television on. There were no trips. No preparations. No exhausted returns. Everything remained the same. Felipe felt growing pressure at his temples. The official narrative was beginning to crumble. Not because of a direct attack, but because of inconsistencies too simple to ignore. He knew this kind of situation. You only had to pull the right thread for everything to collapse. Lucia tried to shift the focus, saying Noah couldn't possibly know everything, that children don't notice complex routines. But that strategy no longer worked. The boy wasn't speaking in suppositions. He was speaking of presence, of daily observation, of something that couldn't easily be fabricated. Laura watched everything in silence, feeling a mix of fear and relief. Fear because the truth seemed frightening. Relief because, for the first time, someone was questioning what she herself couldn't understand. The contradiction about the appointments wasn't just an administrative detail. It was proof that something was deeply wrong. Felipe took a deep breath, realizing he could no longer ignore what was forming in front of him. If Laura wasn't leaving the house and yet they said she was attending appointments, someone was lying. And the question now was no longer whether something was wrong. It was how far it had gone. And as that thought settled in, Felipe began to notice another pattern. A pattern that had nothing to do with schedules or documents, but with his own daughter's body. Felipe shifted his gaze away from the words and began to observe his daughter's body with a different kind of attention. It wasn't the first time he had seen her tired. But suddenly that tiredness took on sharper contours. He started mentally organizing scattered memories, everyday scenes that had once seemed too normal to question. The sleep that always came right after lunch. The heavy drowsiness after dinner. The way Laura seemed to disappear for hours as if someone switched off the light inside her. He remembered the times he had tried to talk to his daughter in the afternoon and found only slow responses, dragged out words, eyes struggling to stay open. At the time, he had accepted the simplest explanation. Treatment. Fragility. Recovery. Now those same scenes rearranged themselves under a new meaning. It wasn't just fatigue. It was too predictable. Too repetitive. Felipe observed Laura's thin body, thinner than it should have been. The weight loss had been attributed to lack of appetite, to stress. But he realized that this too followed a pattern. The meals after which she slept the most were precisely the ones accompanied by juice. Always juice. Never water. Never another liquid. The coincidence began to bother him almost physically. Laura confirmed in a low voice that her head felt foggy in those moments. It wasn't pain. It wasn't ordinary dizziness. It was as if her thoughts drifted away, as if she were only half present. Sometimes she remembered someone talking to her, but couldn't remember what had been said. Sometimes she woke up with the feeling that time had slipped through her fingers. Noah nodded immediately, recognizing it as something he had seen many times before. He said Laura often tried to stay awake but couldn't. Her body simply gave in. Sleep came fast, heavy, almost forced. And when she woke up, she seemed confused, as if she had lost something important along the way. Felipe felt a chill run up his spine. He knew accounts like that. He had read about substances that don't cause immediate collapse, but gradual wear. Something designed not to raise suspicion. To seem natural. To turn clear signs into something easy to justify. The mental fog stopped being a vague symptom. It became an indicator. Lucia tried to minimize it again, saying that this was common in patients with delicate medical histories. But Felipe no longer listened the same way. He compared explanations with facts, and the facts were beginning to align with frightening precision. Timing, effects, frequency. Everything matched. Laura confessed that she hated that sleep. That she felt afraid to fall asleep after drinking the juice, but couldn't explain why. It was a nameless fear. A discomfort that came even before her body gave in. Felipe closed his eyes for a moment, feeling guilt tighten its grip. How many times had he seen that and chosen not to look deeper? The garden felt narrower now, as if the truth were pushing everyone closer to the center of the problem. Felipe took a deep breath and realized that it was no longer possible to treat this as a medical coincidence. It was a pattern. And patterns exist because someone creates them. He then slowly lifted his eyes to Lucia, not with anger yet, but with something more dangerous. Certainty taking shape. He knew that to move forward he needed to ask the right question. A question that could not be sidestepped with generic explanations. And Lucia realized that in the very same instant. Felipe took a deep breath before speaking, like someone who knows that the next sentence will completely change the course of a conversation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply did what he had always done when he needed to separate truth from performance. He asked for facts. He said directly that he wanted the doctors' names. The exams that had been performed. The prescriptions that had been issued. Dates. Clinics. Any document that could prove everything that had been set up to that point. Lucia blinked more times than usual. It wasn't a visible shock, but it was a clear internal impact. She tried to buy time, saying those papers were stored away, that she didn't have everything on hand. Felipe nodded as if agreeing, but he didn't back down. He said that was fine. She just needed to name one doctor. A single responsible physician. The silence that followed was too heavy to go unnoticed. She mentioned a generic surname, far too common. Felipe asked for the first name. Then the specialty. Then the clinic where the doctor practiced. With each question, Lucia seemed to shrink a little more, like someone trying to remember something that had never needed to exist. The answers came fragmented, imprecise, always accompanied by explanations that were far too long to cover simple gaps. Laura watched everything with wide eyes, feeling a mix of fear and clarity. She realized that this was the first time Lucia wasn't directing the conversation. Wasn't organizing the pace. Wasn't deciding what could or could not be said. Felipe was dismantling the structure with surgical calm, without raising external suspicion, but making it clear that nothing would pass without verification. Noah followed every question as if he were witnessing something historic. He had never seen an adult question Lucia that way. He had never seen anyone insist. The power she seemed to have was beginning to crack under simple questions. And that gave him a quiet courage. Felipe then asked for prescriptions. He said that if Laura was taking something regularly, there had to be a prescription. Name of the medication. Dosage. Frequency. Lucia tried to say they were supplements, general guidance. Felipe interrupted politely but firmly, saying that even supplements leave records when used continuously. The argument fell into emptiness. Lucia changed strategy. She said she felt attacked. That all of this was unfair. Felipe didn't react emotionally. He simply replied that protecting his daughter was not an attack. It was an obligation. The sentence echoed through the garden like a definitive boundary. There was no more room to evade. Either there was proof, or there was silence. The wind passed through the trees again and Lucia finally stopped speaking. Her eyes searched for invisible exits. Felipe realized he had reached the exact point where lies run out. When there are no more details to invent without contradicting oneself. He then asked the final question, the simplest of all. He asked where the documents were kept. Not when she would bring them. Not who had them. Where? Lucia swallowed hard. Her gaze swept quickly across the garden as if calculating something. It was at that moment that Felipe understood the answer would not come. And when silence became the answer, certainty settled in for good. If there were no documents, perhaps there was something else hidden. Something physical. Something nearby. Something someone didn't want to be found. And Felipe decided he would no longer wait to look for it. The silence still hung heavy when something unexpected happened. Laura, who until then had remained motionless, felt a strange tingling run through her feet. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fatigue. It was a forgotten sensation, almost unfamiliar. Her toes moved slightly, first involuntarily, then with intention. A movement too small to draw immediate attention, but too significant to be ignored by anyone watching closely. Noah was the first to notice. His eyes widened and he took a step forward without saying a word. Felipe followed the boy's gaze and felt his heart race as he noticed the subtle movement beneath the blanket. Laura noticed it too. The shock was as great as the hope. She moved her toes again, this time more clearly, as if testing something she believed she had lost. Felipe knelt immediately in front of his daughter, the air caught in his lungs. He didn't ask anything. He just watched. Laura was breathing fast, startled by her own body. It was as if a part of her was awakening without warning. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath as that simple detail took on an immeasurable weight. Lucia froze. The control she had been trying to maintain cracked for a second. Her eyes locked onto Laura's feet with an intensity that didn't match medical surprise. It was something closer to contained panic. She tried to step forward, saying it could be a spasm, a nervous reflex. But her voice came out far too tense to convince anyone. Laura braced her hands on the arms of the wheelchair, still unable to believe what was happening. The tingling climbed up her legs, faint but present. She felt the ground calling her like an old memory. With effort she placed one foot on the floor. Her body trembled. Felipe instinctively extended his hands, ready to catch her if she fell. She stood for a brief moment, unsteady but real. Enough to shatter every certainty built up until then. Noah covered his mouth, tears filling his eyes. Felipe felt something between shock and indignation. If this was possible now, what had stopped it before? Lucia tried to intervene, saying Laura needed to sit down, that it was dangerous. But no one moved right away. The impact was too great. Laura sat back down seconds later, exhausted, but with eyes shining with confusion and hope. She had felt it. She had managed it. Felipe closed his eyes for a moment, feeling his blood boil. It wasn't a miracle. It was evidence. Something had kept that body inactive. And something, now interrupted, was allowing it to respond again. The garden, which had once seemed like the stage for an argument, turned into a scene of revelation. The impossible had just happened in front of everyone. And Felipe knew that this was only the beginning. Because if Laura had managed to stand even for seconds, then someone had lied about the severity of her condition. And that led to one inevitable question. What else was about to be uncovered? The impact of what Laura had just done still hung in the air when Noah felt he could no longer keep what he knew to himself. That had been the proof he needed. Not a scientific proof, but a living one. The boy took a deep breath, feeling his heart pound so hard it seemed ready to burst from his chest. He glanced quickly at Lucia, then at Felipe, and decided. If there was ever a moment to speak, it was now. Noah said he knew where the vial was kept. His voice came out low at first, but grew steadier as the words fell into place. He explained that it wasn't in plain sight. It never had been. It was hidden on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind spice cans that almost no one used. A place hard to reach, especially for someone in a wheelchair. A place chosen so it wouldn't be found by accident. Felipe felt his body tense. This was no longer an abstract suspicion. It was an address. A fixed point. A hiding place. He asked when Noah had last seen it. The boy answered without hesitation. He said it had been that very week. He said Lucia always climbed a small step stool, carefully moved the cans aside, and grabbed the vial quickly, as if she were doing something that couldn't be seen, not even for long. Laura felt her stomach churn. The kitchen was a familiar place. Safe. Or at least it seemed so. Knowing that something was hidden there, used so discreetly, made that everyday space take on a threatening edge. She remembered Lucia asking her to leave the kitchen at certain moments. She remembered doors partially closed. Everything began to make sense too late. Lucia tried to react immediately, saying it was absurd, that Noah must have seen some ordinary product. But her reaction was too fast. Too defensive. Felipe noticed. He didn't respond right away. He simply observed the shift in her tone, the sudden stiffness of her body, the visible effort to maintain composure. Noah went into more detail. He said the vial had no label. No brand. Nothing written on it. It was just glass and clear liquid. Small enough to go unnoticed but important enough to be hidden carefully. He said he had never seen Lucia use it for anything else. Always for drinks. Always for Laura. Felipe felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew organized kitchens. He knew the logic of how medications are stored. That didn't fit any of them. An unlabeled vial, hidden behind cans, always used before meals. There was no innocent explanation that could support that. Silence took over the space once again. Lucia seemed to be calculating possibilities, measuring how much had been revealed. Laura kept her eyes down, trying to process that something as simple as a cabinet had hidden a constant threat. Noah meanwhile felt a mix of fear and relief. He had said it. He had finally said it. Felipe took a deep breath and slowly stood up. He was no longer facing hypotheses. He was facing a clear path. A path that led straight to the kitchen. And possibly to the confirmation of everything that had been exposed. As he took the first step in that direction, a new question began to form. If there was a vial hidden there, how many other places were still hiding secrets? Felipe took a few steps forward, but Noah spoke again before any adult could move. His voice came out lower, almost like a warning. He said it wasn't only in the cabinet. There was a brief, dense silence, as if everyone were trying to decide whether they really wanted to hear what came next. Noah swallowed hard and added that there was another place. A second hiding spot. More concealed. Colder. Literally. He said he had seen Lucia open the freezer at a strange time, outside of meals, when she thought she was alone. Not the front drawer, not the top section. It was the back. Behind old packages, forgotten boxes, crumpled bags. There was a simple black bag with no identification at all. Nothing that would draw attention if someone opened it quickly. Everything calculated to look like mere disorganization. Felipe felt his heart pound harder. A freezer was no place for ordinary medication. Much less for something that needed to be used every day. He asked what was inside the bag. Noah hesitated for a second, as if still afraid of what he was revealing. Then he said it. A smaller vial. Different from the other one. Inside it, a fine white powder, almost like flour. It had no strong smell. No label. Nothing. Laura felt a shiver run up her spine. The image of the freezer, once associated with food and routine, now turned into something threatening. She remembered times when Lucia said she needed to organize the freezer and asked that no one come near. At the time it seemed like care. Now it sounded like isolation. Lucia tried to interrupt, saying this was going too far, that the boy was making things up to cause confusion. But her voice came out louder than she intended. Her emotional control began to fail. Felipe noticed. The detail about the powder changed everything. Liquids could be mistaken. Fine white powder hidden in the freezer could not. Noah explained that he had never seen Lucia mix that powder directly. It always seemed like something that needed to be prepared beforehand. Dissolved. Measured. He couldn't say how, but he was sure that vial was treated with even more care than the other. As if it were more important. Or more dangerous. Felipe felt his jaw tighten. This was no longer just a domestic suspicion. It was something that demanded immediate answers. 2 hiding places. 2 forms. Liquid and powder. A dual method. Plant. He began to realize that this wasn't an isolated impulse, but something structured. Laura clenched her hands, feeling fear finally take shape. It wasn't just about not being able to walk. It was about what was entering her body without her knowing. The freezer, the cabinet, the juice. Everything was part of the same design. And she was at the center of it. Silence once again dominated the space, heavier than ever. Felipe knew he could no longer delay. If this was true, the danger was real and immediate. He needed to see it with his own eyes. And as he prepared to go to the kitchen, one certainty began to form. Someone who makes a point of hiding something in 2 different places is not improvising. They are executing a plan. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the heavy silence before Felipe could move. Susanna appeared from the side corridor of the house, her face tense, like someone who had heard too much and decided she could no longer stay silent. She stopped for a moment when she saw everyone gathered in the garden, quickly assessing the scene, as if confirming something that had been pounding in her mind for some time. Her gaze met Felipe's, and that was enough for him to know. She hadn't come by chance. Susanna took a deep breath and began to speak without beating around the bush. She said she had seen it. Not once. More than once. She explained that on some mornings, while helping around the house, she entered the kitchen quietly and caught Lucia holding the glass of juice with the vial nearby. She saw the drops falling. Phew. Precisely measured. Then Lucia stirred the glass with excessive calm, like someone following a ritual that could not fail. She explained that as soon as she noticed someone's presence, Lucia changed her behavior. She quickly put the vial away and asked in a tone far too firm to seem normal, for Susanna to leave the kitchen. She said it was to avoid distractions. That she was taking care of something important. Susanna said it had always bothered her, but she never had the courage to question it directly. Until now. Felipe felt the impact of those words like a sharp blow. It was no longer a child's observation. It was the testimony of an adult. Someone who had nothing to gain from it. He kept his face serious, but inside he felt the confirmation spread like ice. The method described by Noah now had a second voice. And that changed everything. Laura felt her body tremble. Susanna's words gave concrete form to a fear she had been feeling without knowing how to explain it. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't weakness. Someone really was putting something in her drink. And someone did it carefully enough to leave no visible traces. Lucia tried to react immediately, saying that Susanna was exaggerating, that she had misunderstood. But her voice failed halfway through the sentence. For the first time she didn't sound confident. She sounded cornered. Her eyes scanned the garden as if searching for an invisible escape. Felipe noticed. Noah noticed. And Susanna noticed too. Susanna continued, saying she hadn't spoken before because she was afraid. Afraid of losing her job. Afraid of not being believed. But after hearing Noah, she could no longer stay silent. She said that wasn't care. It was control. And that Laura always seemed worse after the juice. The garden seemed to shrink with every word. Felipe felt the last piece of the puzzle fall into place. What had once been doubt was now confirmation. There was a witness. There was a pattern. There was a method. And there was intent. Lucia remained silent for a few seconds, long enough to feel unnatural. Her face was rigid as if she were recalculating everything. The smile had completely disappeared. There was no longer any attempt to appear sweet or rational. Only a cold tension. Felipe took a deep breath, realizing the line had been crossed. This was no longer a family conversation. It was something far more serious. And as he prepared to move forward, Susanna added something that made the air feel even heavier. She said that this wasn't the worst part of what she had heard. Susanna hesitated for a moment before continuing, as if weighing whether she should really say it out loud. The garden seemed too small to contain what was coming next. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, and then said that one night she passed near the kitchen and overheard a conversation that was not meant for her ears. She didn't see anyone. She only heard it. And what she heard never left her mind. She said Lucia was speaking on the phone, in a low, controlled, almost technical tone. It didn't sound like an emotional conversation. It sounded like planning. Susanna heard Lucia say that Felipe wouldn't live much longer. The sentence was spoken with frightening normalcy, as if it were just an inevitable step in something bigger. The silence that followed those words was what marked Susanna the most. There was no regret. No doubt. Only certainty. Felipe felt his blood turn cold. The idea of his own death, spoken that way, hit him like a delayed shock. He remained still, but inside everything was moving far too fast. The life he believed he was protecting now appeared as a target. He tried to remain calm but felt a tight pressure in his chest, not fear but indignation. Susanna continued, saying that Lucia mentioned special teas. She said they would be something gradual, hard to detect, something that would seem natural. Nothing immediate. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Something that would wear the body down little by little. The conversation didn't sound improvised. It sounded like part of a plan already thought through, perhaps even tested. Laura felt her hands grow cold. It wasn't just her. It wasn't just her inability to walk. It involved her father. The person she needed most. The realization fell on her like a crushing weight. None of this was protection. It was preparation. Control that extended beyond her. Noah felt fear rise in his throat. He had never thought of Felipe as vulnerable. He had always seen him as strong, present, unshakable. Hearing that someone spoke about his death with such calm made everything feel even more real. The danger wasn't in some distant future. It was there inside the house. Lucia didn't react immediately. Her face was rigid, her eyes fixed on some undefined point in the garden. She didn't try to deny it right away. She didn't try to laugh. She didn't try to minimize it. Her silence was more disturbing than any defense. Felipe realized that silence was calculated, as if she were deciding how far the truth could go. Susanna finished by saying that she heard Lucia comment that everything had to look natural, that no one would question it if it was gradual, that Felipe's exhaustion would be attributed to work, to stress. The words sounded like a cold sentence, spoken by someone who had already considered every scenario. Felipe felt something break inside him. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a direct threat. A plan that involved his daughter, his health, his life. He realized he was no longer dealing with someone merely manipulative. He was dealing with someone willing to go all the way. The garden sank into a heavy silence. Laura felt like crying, but she was too frozen to do so. Noah looked at Felipe, waiting for a reaction. Lucia remained motionless, as if preparing for something bigger. And in that moment, Felipe understood that the mask had fallen. Whatever came next would no longer be pretense. It would be direct confrontation. Lucia finally moved. It wasn't a step back, nor a defensive gesture. It was an almost elegant adjustment of posture, like someone deciding to stop acting. Her face closed off, her muscles relaxed in a strange way, and something in her gaze shifted. The softness disappeared. The careful tone evaporated. What remained was coldness. A clean, calculated coldness, unhurried. She looked Felipe straight in the eye, without averting her gaze, without trying to justify herself. Her voice came out low, steady, almost too calm for the gravity of the moment. She asked if he really wanted the complete truth. Not as an open threat, but as a warning. The sentence fell heavily in the air, as if it carried layers that had not yet been revealed. Laura felt an immediate shiver. That was not the Lucia she knew. Or perhaps it was, finally. Felipe didn't respond right away. He observed every detail of the transformation. The absence of nervousness. The upright posture. The absolute control of her own emotions. That confirmed something he had already suspected. The earlier desperation was not fear. It was failing calculation. Now the calculation had been recalibrated. Lucia continued speaking, explaining that there were things he wouldn't easily understand. That not everything was personal. That some decisions had to be made by people willing to do what others would not. Her words were chosen with surgical precision. There was no guilt in them. Only distorted logic. Laura felt her heart race. The way Lucia spoke about her now was different. Not as someone fragile to be cared for, but as part of a process. An element. That hurt more than any direct accusation. She clenched her hands, feeling that something far bigger than she had imagined was being revealed. Noah watched in silence, feeling a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of not being believed. It was the fear of having been right all along. Lucia's coldness made it clear that this wasn't improvisation. It was conviction. And conviction, when wrong, is dangerous. Felipe finally answered, saying that he wanted the truth. All of it. His voice came out firm but loaded with contained tension. He knew that answer would open a door that might never be closed again. But backing down was no longer an option. Lucia nodded slightly, as if confirming a silent agreement. Her gaze swept across the garden one last time, assessing who was present, who was listening, who now belonged to that secret. Control had changed form, not owner. She took a deep breath, ready to say something that seemed to have been kept for far too long. Something that was not just a confession but a revelation of structure, of method, of purpose. And Felipe felt that what came next would not only explain what had been done, it would explain why. Lucia began to speak without haste, as if she were explaining an administrative process rather than an atrocity. She said everything had been designed to appear logical to anyone observing from the outside. That Laura, little by little, needed to seem incapable. Not dramatically ill but limited enough to depend. Dependency generates control. Control facilitates legal decisions. The word custody left her mouth like a technical term, not something connected to a flesh and blood child. She explained that the paralysis didn't need to be permanent, only convincing. It was enough for Laura not to respond when expected, to sleep too much, to forget things, to appear fragile in the right eyes. She said doctors believe what they see repeatedly. That reports are built with time and consistency. And that time was something she had learned to use. Felipe felt the anger rise, but he remained still. Each of Lucia's sentences sounded like a calculated blow. She spoke of his daughter as if she were a dossier. As if Laura's childhood were just a variable within a larger plan. Laura, hearing that, felt her body tremble. Not from physical weakness, but from the shock of realizing her pain had been instrumentalized. Lucia then turned to speaking about Felipe. She said his deterioration needed to be slow. Invisible. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Chronic fatigue. Small health failures. Something that could be attributed to stress, age, work. She used the word accelerate as if describing a schedule. She didn't speak of killing. She spoke of letting it happen. Of allowing the body to give in faster than it should. Noah felt a knot form in his throat. This wasn't a family argument. It was a plan that treated lives like pieces. He clenched his fists, trying to contain fear and outrage. Laura looked at her father, feeling a guilt that didn't belong to her, as if her very existence had been used against him. Felipe finally spoke, asking how long this had been underway. Lucia answered without hesitation. Since before the hospital. Since before the fainting episode. She said crises serve to justify changes. That medical events are opportunities when properly exploited. The naturalness of that answer was more disturbing than its content. She finished by saying that none of it would have worked without patience. Without method. Without silence. And that her mistake had been underestimating a child. No. She said it while looking directly at the boy, without anger, without contempt. Just statement. The garden felt distant, as if everyone were trapped inside a bubble of revelations impossible to unhear. Felipe felt the weight of each word settle in place. There was no longer doubt. No longer interpretation. It was confession. And as Lucia ended that cold explanation, one thing became clear. This hadn't been done alone. Plans of that scale are not born in isolation. And Felipe realized that the next truth would be even greater. Lucia showed no pride as she continued. She showed conviction. She said that this was not the work of an isolated mind. That no one carries out something so complex alone for so long without support. She used the word structure, the way someone talks about a company. She spoke of separated roles, compartmentalized information, decisions that did not pass through a single person. Everyone knew only what was necessary. That was how everything stayed safe. Felipe felt a different weight settle in his chest. This went beyond the house. Beyond Lucia. She mentioned powerful people without naming names, as if names were irrelevant or too dangerous to be spoken aloud. She said there were greater interests, that certain situations needed to be resolved discreetly, efficiently, without drawing public attention. Laura felt a new fear, deeper than before. It was no longer fear of Lucia. It was fear of something invisible, larger, something that could not be faced with simple courage. Something that would continue to exist even if Lucia were removed. The feeling of being small in the face of forces she didn't understand made her tremble. Lucia explained that everything worked like a mission. A clear objective. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Different people handled different parts. One observed. Another supplied. Another guided. She herself, she said, was just a local executor. Not the mind behind everything. That statement fell into the garden like a silent threat. Noah felt his heart race. The idea that other people knew what was happening made the danger feel immediate. He looked around as if expecting to see someone watching from afar. For the first time, the fear wasn't only of what had already happened, but of what could still happen. Felipe kept his face steady, but inside he was calculating risks. Organization. Compartmentalization. Power. He knew that vocabulary. It wasn't the language of someone delusional. It was the language of someone accustomed to operating within systems that leave no easy traces. That explained the care, the methods, the patience. Lucia finished by saying that no one there was irreplaceable. That if something went wrong, someone else would take over. She said it without emotion, as if describing a basic rule. It didn't sound like a direct threat. It sounded like a warning. Laura felt her body go cold as she realized that removing Lucia might not mean the end. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't just shock. It was awareness of scale. Felipe realized that this story had gone beyond the limits of a domestic drama. There was something bigger at stake. Something that would require fast responses and immediate protection. And before Felipe could react, a new sound began to approach the house. A sound that didn't belong with whispered confessions. A sound that signaled external movement. Lucia smiled slightly for the first time since she had dropped the mask. And that smile announced that someone was arriving. The approaching sound took shape before anyone could react. The soft noise of a luxury car pulling up outside the property cut through the garden air like a belated warning. There were no sirens. No rush. Just the unsettling certainty that this arrival was no coincidence. Lucia tilted her head slightly as if confirming something she had expected, and a discreet smile returned to her lips. Two men appeared along the side path, well-dressed, steady steps, controlled posture. They carried no visible weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to completely alter the atmosphere. They looked around with calculated speed, assessing positions, distances, people. They didn't seem surprised by the scene. They seemed informed. As if they knew exactly what was happening there. Felipe felt the danger become physical. It was no longer just a spoken threat. It was something that occupied space, that breathed the same air. He instinctively stepped in front of Laura, a silent gesture of protection. Noah felt his legs tremble, but remained where he was as if running away in that moment was impossible. One of the men spoke first in a low tone, far too polite for the situation. He said that things had gone too far. That internal problems needed to be handled discreetly. That exposure wasn't good for anyone. The words sounded like advice but carried invisible pressure. It wasn't a request. It was an attempt to regain control. Lucia stepped forward, now clearly aligned with them. She said everything could be resolved right there. That it had all been just a misunderstanding that had taken unnecessary proportions. The shift in her posture was evident. She was speaking again as part of something bigger, protected by the presence of those men. Felipe realized that this was the final attempt to silence everything. Not with immediate violence, but with elegant intimidation. With implicit promises of future consequences. He felt his heart pounding, but kept his voice steady as he said that no one was leaving until everything was clarified. The atmosphere fractured at that instant. One of the men exchanged a quick glance with the other. A minimal signal. The kind of communication that doesn't need words. They began to step back slightly, not out of fear but calculation. Something hadn't gone as expected. Perhaps Susana's presence. Perhaps Felipe's reaction. Perhaps the risk of too many witnesses. Lucia noticed the shift and for the first time showed impatience. She said something quickly in a low tone that Felipe couldn't hear. One of the men nodded. The plan now seemed different. Not to control the narrative, but to leave before it was too late. Noah felt panic rise as he noticed the movement. This wasn't an ending. It was a dangerous transition. If they left, they could return in another way. Laura gripped her father's arm, sensing that this moment was decisive. And as the men moved away toward the car, a new sound began to invade the garden. A distant sound but unmistakable. A sound that would completely change the course of that story. The sound of sirens grew too fast to be ignored. It wasn't coming from a single point, but from several, creating an echo that cut through the garden and shattered any remaining illusion of control. Lucia froze for a moment. The well-dressed men stopped their retreat and exchanged a tense look, different from the previous ones. This was not part of the plan. Not like this. Susana took a deep breath and confessed that she had sent a message minutes earlier, when she realized the situation was getting out of control. Her sister worked for the police. She didn't explain much. She simply said there was an immediate risk involving a child and an attempted poisoning. That was enough. Help didn't arrive by chance. It arrived because someone decided to act in time. Felipe felt his body relax for the first time in hours, but he kept his posture firm. He knew this was not the finish line yet. It was the beginning of the real confrontation. Police vehicles appeared at the main gate and along the side as well, blocking any quick exit. The perimeter closed with precision. One of the men tried to argue, raising his hands in a controlled manner, saying there had been a misunderstanding. But the authority of that arrival left no room for side negotiations. The officers advanced calmly, separating people, asking for documents, imposing order where veiled threat had ruled moments before. Lucia tried to speak but was cut off. For the first time since it all began, she was not directing the situation. Her face, once icy, now showed visible cracks. It wasn't despair. It was frustration. The plan had been interrupted before the final stage. The well-dressed men stepped back further, realizing that any attempt at imposition now would only worsen the situation. One of them still tried to slip away discreetly, but was stopped before reaching the car. Elegance lost its shine when the handcuffs appeared. Laura watched everything with tear-filled eyes, trying to understand how the danger had materialized and at the same time, was beginning to dissolve. Noah felt his legs weaken, but he stayed standing, supported by something he had never felt before. Relief. He had been heard. Felipe held his daughter's hand tightly, feeling that this protection was now more than symbolic. The threat was being named, recorded, contained. And that changed everything. As Lucia was led away from the garden, she looked one last time at Felipe. There was no apology. No remorse. Only the awareness that she had lost control at the wrong moment. And when the sound of the sirens began to fade, a new silence took its place. A different silence. Not one of fear. One marking the end of immediate danger. But Felipe knew there was still something missing. What came after? The days that followed were quiet but not empty. The house underwent inspections, forensic examinations, repeated questioning, details turned over with care. What once seemed impossible took concrete shape in official reports, expert analyses, sworn statements. Lucia was formally charged, and the connections she had hinted at began to be investigated with heightened attention. Nothing was resolved overnight, but nothing remained invisible. Laura began a slow recovery process, without haste, without pressure. In the first days there was still fear. Fear of her own body. Fear of trying and failing. But little by little, something changed. The exhaustion lessened. The mental fog began to lift. Sleep stopped being imposed and became natural again. Each small improvement was celebrated as a quiet victory. Noah followed everything from a distance, still processing the impact of what he had lived through. He didn't see himself as a hero, just as someone who couldn't stay silent. Felipe made a point of staying in contact with him and with Susana, recognizing that without that courage, nothing would have been stopped in time. Sometimes, saving someone doesn't require strength. It requires a voice. The day Laura managed to stand up again on her own was not dramatic. There was no applause. Only restrained tears and a hug too long to be explained. It wasn't about walking. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken without consent. Her own body. Her own will. Felipe decided to turn all of it into something bigger. He created a foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable children in complex family contexts. Not as a public response but as a personal commitment. He knew that stories like Laura's are not exceptions. They are simply less heard. The house gained new sounds. Short laughter. Conversations without fear. Laura began to occupy spaces she had once avoided. The kitchen stopped being a place of threat. The garden became just a garden again. But nothing there returned to being naive. And perhaps it never should. One afternoon, as Noah walked along the same stone path he had run down that day, he stopped for a moment, looked around, and understood that telling the truth changes destinies, even when it seems too late. And perhaps the question that remains for anyone who hears this story is both simple and unsettling at the same time. How many truths are still trapped in the silence of someone no one listens to? This story ends with justice, but it could have ended in silence. How many times have you ignored something strange because it seemed too unlikely? How many times have you trusted simply because it was more comfortable not to question? Laura learned to walk again, but other children may still be standing still, not because of their bodies but because of fear. Noah spoke up, but how many Noahs are still being dismissed right now? If you had been in that garden, would you have listened to the boy, or would you have told him to be quiet? Leave your comment, share your opinion, and say what you would have done in Felipe's place. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following stories that reveal truths many people prefer not to see.